All right, so part of my personal mission, is to try to help awaken the church to the needs and challenges that the emerging generations are bringing to the table. Right, so I have three kids: 20 years old, 18 years old, 15 years old. Amazing kids, Emily, Annika, and Zach. I've got one kid at Berkeley. And one kid at Biola, Christian school in LA. Those are two very different schools, but the only thing that's similar is that the letter B, they start with the letter B, and they're in California. And then my son is in high school. This is awesome, all the visuals. It's like a disco presentation with my slide decks. So part of my mission is to try to help awaken the church to the needs and challenges that millennials and Gen Z are presenting to us. And it's not just because, of course, there's always generational challenges. That's true. There's for millennia, there have been concerns about the next generation. But what's happening is that this digital context, the increasing secularization of our society, a lot of different pressures are putting unique challenges in front of us. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Several of my books have been on this subject: Unchristian, You Lost Me, and a new book called Faith for Exiles. And then we had this incredible opportunity of working with World Vision, this global company, this global organization, to be able to widen what we've been doing here, mostly in the United States, the last decade. And so we're going to be presenting this big new study today called The Connected Generation. And we're actually launching officially the U.S. version of that study. Did you all get that in your packs? So what's cool about that is that there's these three sections. We're going to talk about sort of the emotional and demographic climate of this generation. That's the first section. The second section is on resilient discipleship, and then the third is on activating millennial and Gen Z leaders. And you'll see we've got a little picture here of these field guides, questions, things you can bring into your congregation to try to activate that. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you how you can get our PowerPoint slides today, because we really want you to take these tools and use them in your congregation to try to bring about the important conversations that you need to have with and for and on behalf of this emerging generation. So that's where we're going to start. Now, I have the privilege of working with Brooke Hempel. She leads our team in Atlanta. We're based here in Southern California, but she leads the research team, our Senior Vice President of Research, Brooke Hempel, and she's going to lead us through the very first section of this on sort of the emotional climate of this emerging generation. So you welcome Brooke Hempel to the stage with me. Thanks, Brooke.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yes, I need the power. This is the real power. Fantastic. Well, thank you. I'm really excited to be able to share about the study with you all, because if you followed Barna's work for years, you may know we've done a lot of US-based research and a little bit of international research, mostly Europe. But we haven't had the opportunity to do something of this magnitude before, mostly because in previous generations, if you wanted to do international or global research, which what I did in my former job, it was really expensive and really time-consuming because you had to put people on the ground. And today, in the connected world we live in, we could actually reach this age group with a very good representation in a global sense because of the advances of technology. So for the first time, we were able to do a truly global study, 25 countries, and know that we were actually representing a good, solid chunk of the population, that this wasn't just an outlier, that this was really the future of these countries. So this is on the map, the countries where we did our research. You can see we worked really hard to make sure we were representing all different continents or regions of the world, and we kind of hand-selected the countries that we went to represent different types of culture and different types of areas within that region, so that we would get a good flavor of what faith and culture looked like in those areas. So this is our map of where we have done this research with a fantastic, huge sample of young adults, 18 to 35, around the world. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about what we learned regarding how connected they truly are. One of the things we learned is that people around the globe in this age group, young people, 18 to 35, are more alike around the world than they are alike with people in their own country. And that actually was a phrase spoken to me unprompted by a pastor. So I live in Atlanta, a pastor in Atlanta. He leads one of the sites of a large African-American church. And he's a millennial. He's 34. And he said, I have more in common with another millennial in Japan than I have with some of the elders in my own church because of the cultural differences in our experiences and our shared experiences. So what does that mean for the church? That you've got this globally connected generation. So before we jump into some of the church implications, I want to just help you understand what it looks like to be connected. In what ways are they connected? So first of all is we kind of thought with the number of countries we were going to and the diversity of their backgrounds with regarding to religion, that we'd see a lot more secularism. We'd see a lot more diversity in terms of their beliefs. But actually, the belief in spiritual forces is quite strong for this generation, no matter where they are. So what you'll see on all these slides I'm going to walk through, the global number, which is the average of all 25 countries, is in the lighter blue, and that dark blue is the U.S. number. So the first thing you see in this slide, in this graph, is that the U.S. is more like the global number than it is different. They're very, very similar. So, for example, on the right side here, these darker colors, the answer to this question, do you believe in spiritual forces? About half of young adults say, yes, I am certain they exist. And this includes countries in secular contexts like Europe. This includes countries in very religiously diverse contexts like in Asia. And regardless, what we see is there is a belief in the spiritual. There is a belief that that is something that exists and is real and that it needs to be paid attention to. But there are a lot of things that cause people to doubt those spiritual forces or the spiritual dimension. So these are some topics that we said, hey, what are the things that cause you to doubt things of a spiritual nature? And people, of course, would think about that in the context of whatever their own religious context was. So it might be, what are the things that cause you to doubt Christianity if you're in a Christianized country, or to doubt other religions if you're in an other religion-dominated country? But the topics that most impacted that belief in spiritual forces are the hypocrisy of religious people, above all. Hypocrisy is the number one thing that causes people to doubt the spiritual. Science is right behind it, and we've increasingly seen this by generation. Today's Gen Z is even more pulled by what they believe are fundamental beliefs in science, that is the only thing that can be known is what science shows us, right? So those are two really important forces that cause people to call into question things of a spiritual nature. Human suffering, conflict in the world, those are two other really big ones, and that's why it's great to be interpreting this in the context of the work that World Vision does, because people don't simply want to believe, they want to see what that means, right? So, and yesterday one of our very clever pastors said, hey, by the way, this slide would be a great list of topics to preach through. So if you all have the monograph and you want to make a note, that's a really good point. All right, so let's talk about this connectedness and what it means. What we uncovered in our data set was that in this generation, we see this movement or this feeling of going from chaos to connection. And I'll explain what that means in these slides. So first of all, the ways in which we are connected globally, you see in the two green numbers at the top, these are young adults who said events around the world matter to me. 3/4 said that. And I feel connected to people around the world, well over half. So you see that, you're getting a party in the back with the balloon coming down. You see that the people in this sample all around the globe said, hey, I feel really connected to what's happening all around the world. However, I don't feel super connected to the people close to me. So relationally, they said, a third said, I often feel deeply cared for by those around me, so only a third. And similarly, only a third said, I often feel someone believes in me. So if you think about our human minds trying to process all this, I can know all of what's going on in the world, and I feel connected to it, which means that in my heart, I'm supposed to care about that. And yet, I don't have the foundational relational support to process that at a local, personal level, right? So there's this sense that comes out of this of anxiety. This connected generation feels that impact of all these broad global trends, which many are overwhelming to process in different contexts, more so than they feel loved and supported by those close to them. That is not a good place to be living, I must say. So on this slide, you can see how that breaks down by the different regions we went to, by the different countries specifically. You can see on the far left there, the top corner, the US and Canada. This is, the first side is the percentage of people who say they feel deeply cared for, and then the flip side is the opposite of that, those who say they feel lonely or who we determine feel lonely and isolated based on their responses. So you can see sometimes there's a balance and sometimes there's a significant imbalance, but in the US, just as many people feel cared for as feel lonely and isolated. And actually we ran, this is super nerdy, we ran some other stats comparing this to other metrics around the world, and we found that the more developed the country people came from, the more anxious and lonely they felt. Fascinating that our modern society is damaging our psyche in that way. So the emotional portrait of young adults, these are the good things. Those who feel cared for, those who feel supported, like someone believes in them, who feel satisfied with their life choices, secure in who they are, hopeful about the future, able to accomplish my goals. So those are the positive things, and you see none of those is rising above 30%, or 33%. So none of those is rising above a third. And again, global and US look pretty much the same here. Negatively, doubt and pressure. I feel uncertain about the future. That's particularly high in the US. Unable to do what I want to do or to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. That's also a little higher in the US. Pressure to be successful. That's significant. That's a very American trait. And a need to be perfect. So again, very few of those are rising above half, so it's still a minority, but it's a significant, substantial size minority, right, of those who feel these negative pressures alongside the positive. Worried, I'm anxious about important decisions. That's a particularly, again, American and Western trait that we saw a lot. Afraid to fail. That is so characteristic of this generation, right? So that whole worried section. Insecurity, vulnerable, sad, and depressed, and then also in terms of just opportunity, not feeling enough that there's enough opportunities that are available to me. That was not quite as common. Mostly what you see here are the emotions of either connectedness or isolation, right? And when we are disconnected, that anxiety rises. So we actually looked specifically at some questions about feeling sad or depressed or feeling anxious about important decisions, these ways that we define this, and we found that globally about 1 in 5 young adults feels some sense of anxiety, but it's 3 out of 10 in the US. And again, that stat of that's highest in those most developed countries. That's a lot. If you have young adults in your congregation, that's a lot of young people who are struggling with anxiety. So this generation, more than any before them, needs an emotionally connected church. They need a church that's going to speak to where they are and the uniquenesses of growing up in the culture they've grown up in. And while life stage is constant over the generations, and while the experiences they're having may be familiar to those who are older than them, the culture and the context in which they are having those is so different than anything we've seen before, that they really need someone to help guide them through this stage and this process in their lives. So they don't merely need to know that Christianity is true. They need to understand and feel and experience that it is good. It's not enough to believe. You have to experience this, right, in this generation. So I'm going to let David pick it up here and talk about, well, what does it look like to have these emotionally connected, resilient disciples?
Cool, thank you. Thank you, Brooke. Would you give her a hand, please? So part of what I want to talk about in discussing resilient discipleship is some of the work that I've been doing over the last decade, try to understand some of the challenges, even you saw the data point on the hypocrisy of religious people. That's really the story of the book on Christian, right? That people sort of see us for all the things we're against. They think of the church as being a group of self-righteous people, and really what I find in American Christianity, at least, is that we're more concerned about the unrighteousness in this emerging generation than we are about the self-righteousness in the church. It turns out Jesus is just as concerned with our self-righteousness as he is with the unrighteousness in the world. And so I want to talk a little about some of the things we're seeing about resilient disciples and how it is that I actually think I don't have any simple answers. I think part of what we learn by studying millennials and Gen Z is that there are no simple straightforward, like you can't just hire a young worship pastor and solve your millennial problem. Right? And so we so often hear this is like, okay, was it just a matter of music style or who we hire or graphics or, sort of lighting the stage? And it actually goes much, much deeper than that, right? We all know that and understand that, but I want to remind you just how deep and challenging some of the questions are that this generation is asking of the church. So let me just quickly show you. We've got the Connected Generation. Again, World Vision has been just an incredible partner, theconnectedgeneration.com. We did 2.5 hours of a webcast on this material, and you can go back and watch that with your teams at theconnectedgeneration.com. That's all for free. And then I did this new book called Faith for Exiles. And this is the end of a trilogy for me, Unchristian, You Lost Me, and now Faith for Exiles, which really looked at these different groups. So with Unchristian, I was looking at young non-Christians and their negative perceptions of the church. And then with You Lost Me, I looked at the left-hand side of that chart of prodigals and nomads, and really like what are the reasons why young people who grow up in faith walk away from faith. And it's a pretty heartbreaking but sacred journey to listen to people who've become disaffected with their faith, who've deconverted from Christianity. And really what we decided to do in this Faith for Exiles project was to look, instead of what's going wrong, like what's going right. And we find that here in the United States, 10% of those who grow up Christian have the qualifications for what we describe as a resilient disciple. Okay, well, what are those qualifications? It's pretty straightforward. They are very active in their church or in a church-type community. They believe in the authority of Scripture. They believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and they want their faith to be active and alive outside the walls of the church. Like it's 4 basic items. Now, you could define it differently, but here's the interesting thing: like only 10% qualify as resilient disciples. Right? Like, despite all this Christianity, all this stuff, all these programs, all these publishing, all the events, all the conferences, all the camps, only 10% of young people 18 to 29 in this particular sample are resilient disciples. So what can we learn from them? And that's actually what's really cool. These 10% are so inspiring in terms of their faith. Their devotion to the church, their love for Scripture, their passion for Jesus is incredible. And so we learned so many things from this group, and I'm just going to show you a few of those things. But first, let me show you the global picture, which is that the U.S. is very similar to other Western contexts, other English-speaking contexts. You can see where the U.S. Context there is the second line. You can see the global average. You can see Canada, for example, there's a smaller percentage of habitual churchgoers. You can see that in Western Europe, you've got even smaller percentages of resilient disciples. But look, every single context has resilient disciples. More Christianized contexts like Africa are even more likely to express, to meet these qualifications. That's a good thing. In Asia, by the way, those are mostly multi-faith contexts, and I've excluded from that chart those who are not Christians because we're just looking at those who've had some sort of Christian experience. But listen, there's too many young people who walk away from faith. There is more that we need to do to understand and partner with resilient disciples. So many interesting, I think, implications of this chart. Now, here is what I want to share with you quickly about the context, something I've been working on, thinking about for the last 10 years. About 12 years ago, I was a volunteer at our local youth group here. We live in Ventura, California, about 3.5 hours, depending upon when you drive. Sometimes it can be about 7 hours. I'm hoping it won't be that long this afternoon. But we live in Ventura, California, and I was a volunteer in our youth group. And one of my best friends is the youth pastor at that time, Eddie Ramos. And a young woman by the name of Colleen says, I wonder what the Bible, she asked Eddie, what does the Bible have to say about selling my eggs? And Eddie and I looked at each other. We're like, we're not quite sure what you mean because we thought you live in a small apartment, and how do you have backyard chickens? Luckily, I didn't actually say that to Colleen, but this is a true story, right? So she had found online a fertility clinic. She had turned 18, and for thousands of dollars, she could donate her eggs. Wouldn't that be like a good thing to do, to donate her eggs to a couple that couldn't have a baby? And so we walked through the whole process with her of like, okay, well, what is it that's motivating this question? Is it money? Is it purpose? Is it, what is it that you want to do? Like, do you realize that this raises the possibility that you would have a genetic baby in the world someday? She's like, oh, wow, I guess I never even really thought about that, right? And so here is the interesting thing. Every generation goes through their own sort of journeys of faith, and we all do, whatever our age, but especially those young adults and teenagers. But what's happening is that technology, what I call digital Babylon, is changing the context. It's changing the pressure points. It's as a friend of mine, Kara Powell, who leads a group called Fuller Youth Institute, she says 14 is the new 24. Right? 14-year-olds are dealing with 24-year-old realities. And then she also says 28 is the new 18, right? So they're dealing with young pressures even as teenagers, but then they're also like having to grow up. So they grow up sort of slower by most sort of like conventional thinking about what does it mean to go through the stages of adulthood. So here's a picture of this digital Babylon that I think we should like just sit and marinate in this as pastors and leaders. And what we did was we estimated the number of hours that someone would get sort of screen-based media in a typical year, and this is, iPads, smartphones, social media, all the different sort of like content and formats, all the rest. This is probably a pretty conservative estimate that a typical 15 to 23-year-old is getting about 3,000, just under 3,000 hours a year, right? Now, even a really good churchgoer is getting only about 290 hours of spiritual content, and that could include YouTube and spiritual apps, other kinds of things, Bible reading. So this imbalance is part of what I think we experience. And so how do we disciple people in a world where, as I say now, we're doing dial-up ministry in a Wi-Fi world? Right? Like, how is it that we're going to be able to help this generation form a plausibility structure of what does it mean to live faithful Christian lives in a world where this is taking place? A couple quick stories. So one story is that, as an example, how many of you have seen an episode of The Office? Yeah, all right. So the thing that makes The Office funny, the television program The Office funny, is that it's true enough about what happens in workplaces and offices. And, like a lot of days I'm the doofus boss, Michael Scott, and some of you might be that person too, right? Like, that's true enough that this happens. But the thing is, it's entertainment. It's meant to sort of be a cynical look at the office dynamics. But here, for this generation, I mean, my kids, there was actually they watched The Office all the time. There was actually a researcher we had come to present at our collab who was saying that when they do a lot of media research. When they do research with millennials and Gen Z, these millennials and Gen Z say, we watch The Office to help us sort of like escape the pressures of the anxious world that we're living in. It's actually like just a moment of us like young people actually talk about this as like part of their medication for dealing with their world. And so here's the interesting thing is like what happens for young people who come into an office setting, or any of us who are being discipled by the programs and the things that we watch. Like, the church is much less likely to have actually really vocationally discipled someone than the program The Office, right? So how is it that we're going to be able to speed up the pace of our presentations, of our plausibility of the Christian way of life in things like work and marriage and relationships and sexuality and all these different areas? So that's a one quick story. Here's the conclusion from this: is screens disciple. For those of us who are parents of millennials and Gen Z, or those who are going to be parents, or who have young kids, I mean, we're living in just an absolutely unprecedented time when the pressures of raising young people in this new era, like how are we going to do that? Now, there's some really amazing parts about being in the connected generation, but it also means that we as the church have to strengthen our theology, strengthen our practices in order to meet up to this moment. And so here are these different pressures that we believe every generation is facing, and yet, in particular, those in digital Babylon have different and more particular pressures. So Google becomes our sex educator. The fertility clinic that Colleen came across. How should I live in today's world? Who am I really? Am I loved? So here's the thing we found about these resilient disciples is that they were very different in 5 particular ways that correspond to these questions. And these were these 5 practices of these resilient disciples. So the 10% are very different than habitual churchgoers or prodigals and nomads by these 5 factors. They experience Jesus. There is a sense of cultural discernment that they practice. They don't just sort of love going to church. They actually like church people. They have been vocationally discipled, and then there's a sense of countercultural mission. And so a lot of the project goes into that. By the way, it warms my heart that you're taking pictures of my slides. That's like one of the, thank you for that. And I'm going to give you the PowerPoint if you want at the end. I'll give you a way to text in and get it. So that's all cool. All right. Here to make you happy on a Friday. Okay, so here in the global study we did with World Vision, what's really cool is a lot of the same things we discovered, which is that young people who are resilient disciples across these different contexts, this is just the U.S. resilient disciples, but look, prayer and scripture become the foundation of resilience. Prodigals, look at some of the differences between, habitual churchgoers. The second one there, read scripture on my own, only 42% compared to 87% of resilient disciples. Just really fascinating differences here. Also vocation, identity, big differences there in terms of resilient disciples. Remember that habitual churchgoers these are young people who are habitual churchgoers. They're in our churches almost as often as resilient disciples, so they're there pretty frequently. And so just all sorts of different ways in which we find these interesting differences. What's missing from faith communities, my friends attending, regular meeting with a mentor, my family attending, opportunities to fight injustice and oppression, support groups for challenges in my life, workshops for strengthening relationships, opportunities to care for the poor and needy, social gatherings outside of the worship space, leadership opportunities, opportunities to connect with older generations. So again, a lot of this whole second section in the book you just got is about resilient disciples, about what it is that we can do to help spark those kinds of partnerships in our churches. So those field guides, I think, in that book that you received in your World Vision bag will be very helpful to you. Okay, so the last section I want to talk about is this idea of developing connected leaders and activating this emerging generation and how it is, like, isn't it just an amazing finding that we're seeing these young people around the world who are resilient disciples who want to take on the mantle of leadership. Like, the church is in good hands. And I think some of us who, sort of complain about millennials or Gen Z, it's like we're the generation who raised them, but we like to complain about them, don't we? And so here's some things we see. First, 82% of young adults say that society is facing a crisis of leadership, And I think Brooke showed you earlier, 77% of young people said that events around the world matter to them. This was one of the highest, most agreed to statements in all of our research across all the different contexts. You can see here in North America, is that at 85%? Huge numbers of young people around the world say that is the case. What are the kinds of issues and challenges? Why is it that they believe that we are facing a crisis of leadership? Well, there's more awareness of the kinds of issues and challenges that we will face as local and sort of regional and country and global communities. And remember, this is one of the interesting things about the digital age, isn't it? Like, for the first time in human history, I'm going to pull out my smartphone here, on Twitter, on social media, you're going to see in an instantaneous way the suffering of other people. You're going to experience police brutality, or you're going to experience issues in the Middle East. You're going to experience the refugee crisis. You're going to experience, the pressures of the world in a way that, like, is unbelievable, right? Like, the speed of information traveling and hitting us, and then you go from one app, you're on your social media feed and you're crushed by the weight of some major catastrophe, and then you go over, to Angry Birds or, to TikTok or whatever, right? Like, it's like the pressures, that sense of this, like, this sort of head-snapping, whiplash sort of feel. Like, how can we as church communities give people a deeper connection to what it really means to be human in this sort of whiplash-orienting way? Here are some of the pressures that this generation says that they feel has to be addressed. You can see corruption, global climate change, pollution, racism, extreme poverty. You can see that practicing Christians around the world are a little bit less likely to mention climate or ecological issues as compared to those without a faith commitment. Here in the United States, among young adults, I don't have any slides to show you, but it's in your book, that especially young people in the U.S. are saying that racism and education and healthcare are big issues here in the United States. So there are particular ways, this is a global picture, but there are some things that you have to look at in terms of our national or regional context. And that's what that U.S. book will give you. So here are three things. I'm gonna go through a run of slides, 3 different slides that maybe give you some ways of thinking about developing connected leaders. So here's the first. What is a way we as local church leaders could help develop these kind of connected leaders? Number one is give them real opportunities to contribute. Look at the statements. I've learned what it feels like to be part of a team through my local church. I'm given real chances to contribute to my church. I have access to leadership training for ministry through my church. You can see resilient disciples are even more likely than other young churchgoers to say that's the case. Here's a little question you could ask yourselves about whether you're giving young people real opportunities is if they fail, would they make you look bad in such a way that you would, like, you'd have to explain it to somebody and they might really make you look bad. And young people really recognize the difference between like a sand pit where they won't get hurt and they won't hurt others, and real opportunities where like if they shine or if they don't do as well as you expect, like it's gonna reflect back on you. And that this generation is looking for real opportunities to contribute, not just sort of a safety playground where you can't really hurt yourselves or others. Number 2, modeling faithfulness. I've been inspired to live generously based on the example of people at my church. I've been inspired to be a leader. I've been inspired to be a missionary. At spring break this last year in April, my good friend of mine, Dudley Chansey, I asked him to take my kids to Honduras and me, and so my 2 youngest kids, we spent a week building houses and working on different projects there. And Dudley's an amazing guy. He's a youth ministry professor in Oklahoma. And I think he's spent millions of his own dollars just doing stuff in Honduras. It's just really inspiring. And ever since then, my kids are like, when I'm like, I go to the store and I want to buy, some clothing or whatever, they're like, Dad, what would Dudley do? And I'm like, guys, that's not the question I wanted you to ask. So I love it because they've been inspired to live generously based on the example of Dudley, right? So that's a good example of this modeling faithfulness. How about seeing the needs and serving others? That the church isn't just a place where we sort of create this social club, this place where we, sort of isolate from the world, but we actually better understand the needs of the poor. We have opportunity to serve the poor in our community. We better understand what is happening for the poor globally. We better understand the needs of marginalized people. We better understand social justice. And all of this, by the way, is part of that countercultural mission, that 5th element that these resilient disciples practice very differently. They live a different kind of sacrificial life, less entitled. We're all still consumers. We're all still we're very privileged here in the United States. But there is this real sense that these resilient disciples have been learning rhythms and practices of giving of themselves, of serving others, that I think is just really, really powerful. So some conclusions for us. Number 1, we found in this research over and over again in the qualitative interviews that we've done, in the work that I've done for Faith for Exiles, in sort of our global quant research, that the connected generation doesn't just want the church to be a place where you pray and raise your hands and worship together, but they want it to be a laboratory of leadership, a laboratory of real life issues. Even in a place like Scotland, very secular, but like young non-Christians are like, maybe the church could help us with the real life issues of marriage and dating and finances and work. And so there's this real interesting kind of counter trend to the secularization of this emerging generation. Where like maybe Scripture, maybe the church really has something to offer. Maybe there's actually some good, not just truth, about how we live as people. And so it's just amazing to see that this generation is asking the church to respond in that way. Here's a couple of examples of that in the data, in the global data, and then in the U.S. Because of my beliefs, it is important that I'm concerned about the welfare of others. You can see resilient disciples there at 72%. I give of my time to help others in need at 85%. I stand up against injustices, against injustices that are against individuals or groups I stand up against corruption. I give of my own resources. Again, I think so often we wring our hands, we worry ourselves about the profile of this emerging generation, but this is a generation of hope, of trying to solve things. Of course, they have their issues, they have their challenges, they're dealing with anxieties and pressures that are unique and not so unique, but this is a generation that doesn't want to be just consumers, they also want to be contributors. They want to be asked to do things in the world. They want to be part of a greater mission than I think the usual, typical American life gives us. And so the church, I think, stands at the precipice to be able to do this. Now, here's why I said this is not easy. These 5 practices that I showed you earlier, they're not simple. They're not just things you can hire someone for or just, have a good teaching series about, although that is not bad. Preaching is as important as ever, but it's just not sufficient alone to disciple in digital Babylon. So we've got to rethink some of the ways we're doing this. We've got to think differently about how the church can show up. Well, a lot of what our resources are designed to do is to help you do that. So as I said, you can get a lot of free resources. I know you're getting a lot of the tools here. This is the global report. I think some people are getting this, some people might not, but you can get the global report on the website. Also at Barna, we've been working at a way to try to give just sort of a more inclusive way of getting all of we've done more research in the last 3 years than the last 35. So you can sign up for Barna Access if you're interested, get all of our digital stuff on lots of different things at Barna Access, access.barna.com if you're interested. And then here's where I promised I would give you the PowerPoint for free. So if you're interested to get today's presentation and other great resources on the Connected Generation, including access to some of the videos and interviews that we've done, you can just text the word World Vision to 44222. All right? Okay, guys, this is a fun thing just for us to be able to think together about how this emerging generation may change the church, right? How it is that they're going to bring and put a certain stamp on what it is that God is doing in and through his bride. And so we're going to invite Brooke to interview a couple of leaders here, Darren and Jeannie. And Brooke, would you guys mind coming up? And we're going to ask them a little bit. They're going to introduce themselves and talk a little about their work. But also just, we're going to take some questions, and we'd love to hear from you. Again, this is an amazing opportunity to use research. So often it's hard for us as leaders. It's a privilege to do research because, it's hard for us to get outside of our own frames of reference. And so research is actually very limited, but what it does do is it helps us think and see someone else's thoughts, someone else's perspective. And again, with the partnership with World Vision, what a privilege it is that we got to learn from 15,000 young people who gave us about 30 minutes each of their time. The number of hours, the translation of these surveys with our friends from World Vision, the ability to work in a global context. It's been a privilege just to actually visit some of these World Vision offices around the world and just see how much the people who work at World Vision are just so passionate about serving into church leaders in Australia and New Zealand and Southeast Asia and other places. So what a privilege it is for us to be able to hear from 15,000 interviews and then to use that to help us be more effective in our work. So anyway, thank you so much for listening, and Brooke, take it away.
All right, well, we wanted in these last 15 minutes or so to give you a chance to process what might this look like to act upon some of the data that you've seen. Oh, thank you. So really thinking about the church context, what are things that churches could and should be doing to respond to what we're hearing from young adults that will help them to grow and thrive in their faith. So we wanted to share some thoughts of a couple of church leaders, some pastors that have been really involved with World Vision and we've gotten to connect with through our work with World Vision. And they have already learned from and applied a lot of what we've just seen. And so I'd love to get their perspective. So let me just start with introductions. Darren, you want to start? And then Gene? Introduce yourself and your church.
Yeah, my name is Darren Roundson, and I started a church 11 years ago in downtown Long Beach, so 2 hours from here, with my wife Alex, and I've been leading that church for the last 11 years.
Jeannie.
Hi, my name is Jeannie Stevens, and my husband and I also started a church 9 years ago in downtown Chicago. and we lead a church there of over 50% millennials and Gen Z.
Okay, so you both are talking directly to this generation. First question is, what did you see in the results we were looking at that you thought, oh my gosh, that is us, that's our people, and this is something that's been a core of who we are as a church?
Well, I would say I'm so grateful I've been friends with Dave for a long time, and so I got to see this information unfold over the last year, and every time I saw something new, I felt like I had an inner yes, hallelujah. That's what I feel and experience. Like I wanted to jump up and raise my hands because that is the picture of the people that are in my church. And so I was just so grateful that it affirmed what I already felt. It wasn't a contradiction. It didn't feel polarizing to what I personally was experiencing as a pastor. And so it was a huge affirmation. That was my first experience with it.
Yes, which matters a lot, actually. The two things that we love to use data for, one is to affirm what you're already thinking, is your hunch, like, am I going in the right direction? As the other is to wake you up. So that's great.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. For us, I'm 35. I started church when Unchristian came out, and so that was a huge eye-opener for me. And tracking, our church is about 70% millennial, and watching the stats come out and then watching Faith for Exiles be released, I felt like it was validation in the things we were trying to do, but we didn't necessarily have the language or the cool slides to show. But it definitely was what we felt we were experiencing across the board. I mean, the things that you were saying at the end, David, it's like what the millennials and Gen Z are facing are they don't know how to be human anymore. And I think that's the reality, is like they don't know how to have relationships. They don't know how to manage their anxiety and depression and loneliness. They don't know how to keep a job. They don't know how to have conversations with other people in general. This is what I've experienced in Long Beach and all over the world. And I think what we're getting at is that the church is actually primed up to meet the world's problems. Like, we can teach them how to deal with their anxiety. We could teach them how to deal with their finances. We could help them in their relationships and be emotionally healthy, all things that the scriptures speak of. And we don't have to like hide or try to make it sexy or cool, because people actually are desperate. And so the research just validates, I think, the experience, but more importantly, it also gave us some clear direction on where to go forward in teaching and providing leadership for our church.
Good. So you hit on one topic that I wanted to ask you both about, is this emotional health component, right? So what does it look like? We threw out there, we need an emotionally connected church. What does it look like in your context to be an emotionally connected church? How do you actually live that out in what you do?
Yeah, I appreciate what Dave was just saying. You know, with being a connected generation, you know, you have the world's problems in your back pocket at all times. And they are not simple problems to hold in your back pocket. They are intense, they are heavy, they are deep, and of course they want to lead us into anxiety and depression. And so often when you hold the world's problems in your back pocket and you're checking in on that at all times, the first temptation is to then check out of your own life. And so emotional connection is checking into what's going on inside of you. What's going on inside of your mind? What's going on somatically in your body? What's going on in your heart when you look at the fires in Australia? What's going on in your heart when you look at Iran and Iraq right now? What's happening inside of you? Because so often you want to check into what's going on around the world, but it causes you to then check out of your own pain. And that's where isolation comes, that's where anxiety comes, that's where worry comes, and that's where the spiral of depression comes. And what the world wants to say is that the only solution to that is medication. And while that is a path, and oftentimes a very important path, we have to teach ourselves, and friends, pastors, we have to do this. We have to check in on what's going on in our mind, in our heart, our body, and our soul. If we are modeling to our millennial brothers and sisters, Gen Z brothers and sisters, that we are checking out of ourselves, they're going to do the same thing. So we have to learn how to get present. I think that's one of the biggest things that I am learning about emotional health, is that you cannot get healthy if you are not in the present moment.
Yeah.
And most of us are just rehashing our past or rehearsing our future instead of realizing the presence of God is right here in the present moment. It's the Spirit's zip code. And so if we can help ourselves and our people live in the present, that's where healing is found.
That's such good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the millennials and Gen Z have radar for inauthenticity, and authenticity is the currency of the millennial generation and below. And we can see now, I mean, we see it. The idea of corruption and hypocrisy in our leadership is so evident in the church. We don't want to participate in church because of what we see. And so as leaders, like the first thing to to be emotionally connected or be emotionally healthy is for you to be emotionally healthy.
Yes.
And I think it's actually doing the hard work. It's not just a moment of checking in necessarily. There has to be a process of transformation that you provide people. People don't just need prayer or scripture, and we need a pathway for holistic transformation. I mean, I burnt out in ministry at 27, which is crazy. But at 27, I mean, I was getting serious medical help because of stress and anxiety. I was bleeding in places you shouldn't bleed. They were looking for cancer. And it was because I was a church planner. And how many of you know how many of you know what I'm talking about? Leadership is costly. And what I've learned to help create health in our church is to model it. And so I discovered Pete Scazzaro in New York, his work, Emotionally Healthy, which I can't recommend that enough. The Emotionally Healthy Church, Emotionally Healthy Leader, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. It transformed my life, my marriage, our leadership. Our whole elder staff, all of our team went through it. And then we took our church through it. And so for us, we actually see what's needed are like leadership courses to help people learn the tools that they were never given in their family and they were never given in the church, because the church is like, come to our events, pray more, and read scripture more, which both of those are amazing, but they're not actually helping people with the issues they've collected from their grandparents in the genogram, or the toxicity they have in just reacting to their anxiety in their relationships. So for us, we see it as a process of one of the most evangelistic things we can do for our city, which is full of anxiety and brokenness, is to become people of peace, to become emotionally healthy. And so we bring that emotional health into toxic environments like workplaces or neighborhoods or schools or playgrounds if you're a stay-at-home mom. There's a lot of toxicity on the playground. And we try to help people engage that intentionally. So creating processes for people to change, to see their lives as it is possible to change. And I think that we have had more people go through the emotionally healthy courses that you can do for free through Emotionally Healthy than anything else we've offered.
That's fantastic.
I'm sure you would agree with me on this. This generation is more interested in who you are than what you know.
100%.
They are more interested in who are you for real, not who you portray yourself to be. I had a leader ask me, Jeannie, how do I reveal authentic vulnerability? And I said, well, the biggest problem in that is they said, how do I reveal appropriate vulnerability? And I said, the biggest problem in your question is the word appropriate. Vulnerability gets you sweaty, friends. It gets you uncomfortable. It's a revealer of what's really going on inside of you. And this generation wants authentic vulnerability, not appropriate vulnerability. They can detect appropriate vulnerability like that. And so the work is exactly what Darren said. It's becoming emotionally healthy and emotionally whole. You yourself, and then leading your church that way.
Can I just add one more thing? Because I think that was the big aha moment. When you're starting off a church or when you're leading a church, you look at everyone else and their voices, and you're like, I want to preach like this. I want to tell stories like Judah Smith. I want to be as smart as Tim Keller, or like whatever, Francis Chan. I'm going to do these things, and you realize like you can't do those things because there's only one you. And what I realized is the most powerful tool is actually just being present to who I really am in the limitations, in the strengths, and when that comes out, that's when people are ministered to in powerful ways. And that's what millennials are looking for. They don't want the answers necessarily from the pulpit anymore. They want to see that the Word of God has done something to you. and you're showing them something you've seen, not just telling them something you know. And that's a huge shift in preaching today.
Yeah.
And it takes a different kind of exegetical work for your own soul to bring that to your community. Anyways.
Man, that's such a good word, you guys. I just want to affirm you in what you're doing, because I will say that although you both know that you have attracted a lot of young adults and millennials specifically to your churches, we've seen that those churches that do have this focus on emotional connectivity do exactly that. So it's resonating, it's really connecting with the generation, and we see that really broadly as well. So thank you. One last question. I'm curious, we talked about disciples, and we talked about the relationships that were part of discipling or discipleship for these resilient disciples. So what does that look like for you all in your church? How do you create relationships that will mentor and disciple these young adults and help them really grow into this vibrant faith?
Yeah, so we've reorganized our entire church around creating an environment of discipleship. So we do house churches, we do Sunday gatherings, and house churches are the primary vehicle for discipleship and life in the kingdom. So we see everything we do through the lens of discipleship now, which means we're not looking to grow Sunday gatherings, we're looking to release disciples in ordinary life. And I think that's a huge win for us. So every house church has 4 pastors. It started with 12. It's a whole other story, but we have 4 pastors, and every house church multiplies every year to 18 months. So there's built-in leadership into that. We've asked all of our staff and all of our elders lead house churches. We just said, if this is what we're going to do, we all have to do this together. It can't just be, okay, you guys do that, and I'm just going to check out. So we simplified our ministry and the things that we were doing to empower people. So we have young people leading house churches that's diverse. They're not gender-based. They're not demographic-based or like affinity groups. These are diverse in nature, just like the church should be diverse, but also to culture. So for us, we said every staff member has to be making disciples. So we have internship programs. People come from all over the world to be on staff, and part of our staff is developing the next generation. We have 20-year-olds on staff, 21-year-olds on staff. I'm the second oldest, and I'm 35, and that's a bad thing. We want multi-generation. That's the cry of my heart, is that we're partnering with every generation that's alive today. But it's become a cultural thing, so I felt convicted about this as a pastor. I just felt like we do things in the church because that's how they've been done, and it's like efficiency has become king. And I don't think that was Jesus's MO, ever. And if you just read the Gospels and ask yourself, does my life or ministry reflect the gospel of the life of Jesus in the Gospels? And we've created programs and industry in the church that actually prevents real life discipleship. So I've changed my entire schedule. So the majority of my time is investing in discipleship cohorts in the church. So throughout the week, it's not me alone and doing meetings. It's me with a group of people that I've chosen to covenant for a year to replicate. And I was telling people at 35, I have like a 10-year vision to find my replacement now, because I know that's what happened to me. I was sent out at 20-something years old to start a church. That's way too young. But I'm realizing if I don't find those 15 and 20-somethings now, they're not going to be set up. So I'm looking for my exit strategy in the next generation. And I think that's what we all have to do, is just release them.
That's great. Anything else, Jane?
Well done. I'm just so impressed with your empowerment and your already looking for succession. Thank you. It's a beautiful model. So listen to everything he just said. And what are we doing? What we are doing is we are empowering and releasing what David just said, our people to do actual leadership, not fake leadership. We are taking down the barriers of the sandboxes and not having them come to us saying, what do you need me to do in your church?
Yes.
But them instead saying, here's what God's calling me to do in our church. Yes. And I will tell you, it is very uncomfortable at first as a leader, and it's messy. There's lots and lots of things to clean up often, but I will tell you it's better. It is better. And so that's some of the best work that we're experiencing is we are no longer holding the keys to power. And releasing that over and over and over again, and letting and seeing our younger generation in our church really feel the empowerment to be ministers, the priesthood of all believers, to not see themselves as attenders of your church, but actually priests in your church. We remind them all the time, you are the priests of this church. We are not. And so, that requires a restructuring, that requires a releasing of power, that requires you as a leader really becoming comfortable with not holding it all anymore. That's some of the deepest internal work that needs to take place, but it's better. It's so much better.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for those fantastic insights on this generation and how just to lead them better and serve them better. So I'm just applauding the work that you both are doing in your churches, your context, and thank you for the insights that you've shared with the group here. So would you all thank them, and appreciate your time as well.